Today's video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one online platform for creatives. The Contax G1 is a camera that has always intrigued me. A combination of legendary Carl Zeiss glass and a compact and good-looking titanium body make for a pretty desirable setup. But I've always been curious, does it live up to its reputation, both good and bad? So in the past, when I used to shoot a lot of 35mm, I came very close to purchasing this camera. You know, obviously being a big Contax and Carl Zeiss fan, there was a lot of appeal to me. And recently, my friend Daniel, who also has a YouTube channel that focuses on film photography, you should check it out, I'll put a link below. He let me borrow his copy of the Contax G1 so I could try it out. And, you know, obviously I'm not in the market for a 35mm camera right now, but still very curious just to see how this camera performed. Okay, so just down here by the sea with the Contax G1, just loaded in some Fuji Pro 400H, so gonna browse around for a little bit and see what I can find. So there were always kind of a couple of things that appealed to me about this camera. The first, like I said, just being a huge Contax fan, I'm always down to try something different by them. But the second thing really is just, you know, the fit and the finish and the look of this camera. Just with the titanium build, it looks really nice. It's pretty compact for what it is. And I figured, you know, if I was ever gonna own this, it would probably be something that I use as like a 35mm travel camera setup. But I did have some hesitations just based off of things you would read when looking into other reviews about the G1 and the G2, and that's kind of what I want to focus on today. But first, a quick background on the G system. The G1 was released in 1994 and the G2 in 1996, and these were marketed as premium cameras, with the G1 and 28mm combo costing the equivalent of almost 4,000 USD in today's dollars. But when it comes to the G2, which was the updated version, the biggest kind of upgrade on that camera was a new autofocus system, and then it could also take a number of lenses, which this camera can't. So originally there was a 16, a 28, a 45, and I believe a 90. That's what the original G1 can take. The G2 can also take a 21, a 35, and a 35 to 70, which were released later. But there was an updated G1 version called a green label, which is the same as this camera, but it can take the full lens lineup. So one thing that's jumping out at me right away, you know, it's something that it's not too surprising because I read a lot about it, you know, just people complaining about the size of the viewfinder on these cameras, on the G1 and the G2. And it's definitely on the smaller side, you know, which I wasn't expecting this like massive viewfinder, but you know, for me with SLRs, even other rangefinders, part of the experience is, you know, like being inspired by, you know, the look through the viewfinder when you're composing it. So far, that's just really lacking with this camera. It's quite tiny, quite small, and I find I'm like pressing my eye up against this just to make sure I don't get any stray light, you know, spilling in. So, a little disappointing so far on that front. So this camera doesn't have frame lines like you would expect on a traditional rangefinder. Obviously this is not a traditional rangefinder system, but basically when you swap out the lens, the viewfinder adjusts to show you what that focal length is giving you. So basically what you see is what you get, or say like around 90% of it. But one of the big knocks whenever you're reading about these cameras is that the viewfinder is quite small and also dim, and I can 100% confirm, at least in my experience, this is probably the least inspiring viewfinder that I've ever looked through on a film camera. So from like a usability handling standpoint, I mean, obviously this camera looks super nice. It's titanium, just like the Contax T2. So really good looking camera, handles nice, got good weight to it, pretty comfortable to use, good ergos and stuff like that, other than obviously the viewfinder, which I keep talking about. But the one complaint I have is I've been shooting in aperture priority mode, so I've just been leaving this dial on auto, and I've found that it's super easy to bump it because you can do exposure compensation, basically +1 or +2, and then all the way down to -2 on either side of the automatic mode. And I found the first day I was shooting, there were a couple times where I looked down and it was bumped up to +2 or down to -1. So would love if you could lock this dial, because it seems like it's pretty easy to just accidentally hit. So before we jump into the next few points, I just want to take a second to talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. I've been using Squarespace for a couple of years now for different creative pursuits and businesses, and it's been really awesome just to have this one platform that can handle a variety of different projects. So say something as simple as a clean portfolio website with galleries for my photography, or something a little more complex like I did for my podcast, The Contax Sheet, where I have different episode pages and even a shop to sell merch and t-shirts and things like that. If you check out squarespace.com, you can get a free trial today. And when you're ready to launch, you can use the link squarespace.com/Kyle McDougall for 10% off of your first purchase of a website or a domain. Let's get back into it. The second thing that I was a bit worried about was the autofocus, and you hear really mixed reviews about the autofocus system with this camera. So for me, shooting mostly landscape style images, autofocus performance was something that I was never really that concerned about with this camera, just because the scenarios I'm in aren't really that complex. And, I've bought point and shoot cameras from thrift stores before that can handle the scenarios that I shoot in. So, I really wasn't expecting any issues with this camera, and I didn't have any at all. I didn't have a single frame that was out of focus. But to be honest, if I did, I actually would have been quite disappointed. So, for me, I'm focusing either at like infinity, or I'm locking on a subject a little closer in the foreground and then recomposing. But this camera also has a manual focus mode. I didn't use it at all, but basically it's this dial here, and you can basically adjust it to electronically pick your focus point. But since there's no rangefinder patch when you look through the viewfinder, in a way it's almost like you're zone focusing and just kind of guessing. So I don't think that's an option that I would personally ever use. So with those things aside, when it comes to image quality and performance, this camera definitely didn't let me down, but I didn't expect it to. When you read about these Carl Zeiss lenses for the G lineup, people often say they're some of the finest 35mm optics ever made. And the 28mm, the performance out of it was nice. It was detailed images with nice sharpness, good contrast, good color. But I don't know if that alone, even if the other lenses perform just as well, which I'd expect them to, I don't know if that's enough to kind of sell me on this system and some of those flaws that were bothering me, like the viewfinder itself. Just because, there are lots of other 35mm cameras and brands out there that also make nice optics. So I'm sitting here after using this camera for 2 full days, happy with the performance out of it, but I'm feeling like neutral or even a little bit disappointed with the G1. One of the things I love most about making images is almost just like getting lost in the viewfinder when you're looking through composing. So, obviously the G1 fell short in that department, and I think that's a big reason why it was a little bit of a letdown for me. So to wrap this up, I would say that if you're interested in the G series, I think this is a camera that you really got to try out just to see if it's going to be a good fit. And like I said earlier, you can pick up the original G1 with the 28mm for around $500 US, which, when you take into account the quality of the optics, it's actually a really good deal, especially in today's landscape. For me though, it's a camera that after being able to test it now, I'm actually pretty glad that I didn't invest in it in the past. It's certainly capable, and for some, it may be a really great fit, but the trade-off with the uninspiring shooting experience just really doesn't make it worth it for me.